Well, hi, how is everybody? As usual, I'm really, really happy. I know we had to postpone because of weather, so I'm very happy that those of you who are here. And proud to say that I was just finishing a grant for the Alabama Humanities Alliance. These videos have been watched over 500 times across the span of all of our videos, which I'm pretty proud of. It was nice to be able to write that in a grant. They did give us some funding to do these, Southern Jewish Voices. So I work mostly with Samantha, Ron's daughter.
Yeah.
And what was funny is when I first heard your name, of course, my first thought was, oh, it's the Levitt Jewish Community Center.
No, he spells it wrong.
I know, right?
Ted was a wonderful guy from Germany. He was an executive vice president here. I served with him on the executive committee and the board. He was a really lovely guy and didn't have kids, and he left a good bit of money here at the time we were redoing the building.
Oh my gosh. Speaking of which, we just found these great 1960s postcards on eBay of back in the day when there was a fountain.
Mm-hmm.
It was really fun to find those. Brooks here.
Postcards going for $15.
Yeah.
We need to find a bunch of postcards. It'd be a good fundraiser.
It would be good.
You can make those.
I think there's some in the closet somewhere.
Interesting.
Anyway, I know you are very instrumental and very important in the Jewish community here in Birmingham, which is why I'm so grateful you're here. You were our board president for years. You were on boards of other Jewish organizations. You are still on boards of other Jewish organizations. But my favorite piece of knowledge about you is that you blow a mean shofar. That was my favorite tidbit. So without further ado, Ron Levitt and Margaret Norman.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. It's nice to have this group that understood we were changing to a Tuesday and came regardless, so that's great. I feel like we were joking right as everyone was coming in, this is going to be my hardest interview yet, which it's definitely not going to be because I've had the pleasure of getting to know Ronald pretty well over the last
Absolutely.
3 years. We've worked together at Temple Beth-El, but I'm excited to talk to Ronald tonight because not only did you grow up here in the Birmingham Jewish community, you've been at Emmanuel and Temple Beth-El, and you've held all these leadership positions within the community as well, but you're also so involved in so many of the exciting things that we're working on in our community today. So I know we have way more than we'll get to, but let's jump in and just see where it takes us.
Sounds good.
And I would love to start, as I do with everybody, just hearing a little bit about your early life. Now, when we met in our pre-interview, I learned a few things right there, which is that even though I know you've lived in Birmingham a long time, you were born in Denver, your family has this really interesting story of getting both to the country and to Alabama. And so I'd love if you could start there and tell me a little bit of that.
Sure. Well, I had to go back and think. I think I'm fifth and sixth generation American on both sides of the family, but both sides came from the Pale, Lithuania, Estonia. The most interesting story from my father's side of the family was that his grandfather, on his mother's side, you have to go back and forth, was a member of a family called the Kukla family, which came from Estonia. And I've got a distant cousin in England, who has put together a genealogical history of the family going back into the hundreds, from the little village in Estonia and Lithuania. And he's identified well over 3,000 living relatives that are connected by blood all over the world. And it's really kind of a fascinating story of how all the family members at different times immigrated to different places in the world. A lot of it was to escape the Holocaust. And so in the back of my mind, I always remember my cousin calls it the largest Jewish family that still exists. I don't know if that's true or not, but we do have family reunions. I went to one in New York earlier this year and met cousins I had not met. Actually, what's really kind of makes it small world was one of my cousins is the older sister of a guy I used to know in BBYO from Knoxville.
Wow, that is a small world.
She's a rabbi, and so when I found out what her maiden name was, and I said, "Oh, do you know Pace?" She said, "That's my brother." Huh. So it was one of those kind of fun things. But it's a neat story that would take forever to tell. We've got this book that my cousin has put together that has pictures of as many living relatives as he can find and as many ancestors. So I've got pictures of my great-great-grandparents that are in this book, along with lots of other families. So, but that brought us from the Pale of the Settlement, Ellis Island, Chicago, a lot of family in Omaha still that I don't really know. They're called Cooklands there, not Kukla. And then my great-grandfather got on a wagon train. He was an old tailor from the old country, and he and his wife, Kittle, got on a wagon train that fetched across the plains of Nebraska and ended up homesteading in eastern Wyoming, a place called Torrington, Wyoming. And that family plot is still in the family. It's owned by my cousins now. And that's how we got out west. My dad ended up coming to Birmingham because he had grown up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, had gone to school in Colorado, and then went to dental school at Northwestern. Ended up in Denver, had a dental practice, and he was a frustrated surgeon, became a periodontist. And he was offered a scholarship to come to UAB or go to the University of Minnesota. I think he was fed up with the cold weather, and he came down to Alabama in the late 50s. And think about Jewish families coming to Alabama in the late 50s. So the Wyoming branch of the family said, and the New York, my mother's from Rochester, the New York branch of the family, they both said, "You're moving where? And are there any Jews there?" And
It's funny that the ones in Wyoming would say that too, to me a little bit.
A little ironic. But we moved here. We lived in some apartments that were right below Vulcan. That's where all the dental students apparently lived. It's kind of back behind where State Farm used to be. I think it's the Board of Education building now. I've got a lot of those things that used to be in my head. And then we moved to Tuscaloosa, and I lived on a street down the street from Howard Schnellenberger and Pat Dye, who were football coaches, because we were there in the early 60s. Dad did his residency there. Got to really be a part of the Jewish community in Tuscaloosa, which later in my life became very important because when I went to school in Alabama, in Tuscaloosa, a lot of those families remembered me as a small kid and kind of adopted me and gave me a place to be on the holidays, and I became a member of their Temple Emmanuel while I was in school. In fact, I taught Sunday school while I was in law school because I didn't really have the money to pay dues, and I said, I got to do something. So they gave me a class of 7th grade girls. It was interesting. So, but anyway, so we were in Tuscaloosa, and we came back to Birmingham. We were going to move to Dallas, where my dad had a former classmate that had started a practice, but one of the 5 periodontists passed away in Birmingham, and Dad bought his practice. And we moved in right across the street, these duplexes, right across the street from the JCC. I was 4 or 5, I was little. Went to kindergarten at Miss Rena's kindergarten, which was the precursor to the JCC preschool. A lot of people my age, and David, you probably remember that. We all went there for, David shares out in the audience. Everybody went, that was the preschool the Jewish kids went to, and it became the JCC preschool later, where all my kids went. And so those were kind of the early years. I spent a huge amount of time as a kid at this place, playing all kind of sports and being involved. This was the place to be on Sundays after Sunday school. It was a different kind of Jewish community center because it was mostly Jewish, and it was the place that we all hung out. It was Sundays were mass, especially during basketball season. It was mass chaos with basketball games every hour. We all thought we were so great, and we were all so short. But we learned to play basketball together, and that played out all the way through high school. I was never any good at that. I swam in the swim team. But in addition to things at here, I spent a huge amount of time at Temple Emmanuel, where we joined when we came to Birmingham.
So before we get into that, I want to ask sort of 2 questions about your parents. One, so I should say, if you could tell us their names for the record,
Sure.
too. But then I'd love to hear a little bit about that transition to Birmingham for them, because you did say,
Sure.
you're joking about your family, sort of saying you're moving where. And I'd also love to hear just a little bit more about your family's Jewish background,
Sure.
and then we can get a little bit into growing up at Emmanuel.
Great, good questions. So I'll start with my mom. Her name was Helene, but everybody called her Nina. It was a nickname. She had, I think I used to know the story, but I don't recall now. She grew up in Rochester, New York, in a family that was very, very reform, but it was the traditional reform. Kind of, I don't mean this in any particular way, kind of high church kind of reform services. Her family was very intellectual. There were a lot of people that were in the arts. In fact, her sister was a pretty well-known artist around the world. She's now deceased, and had paintings that hung in a lot of places around the world. She had really weird abstract art that I was not smart enough to figure out, but she was pretty well-known. Her name was Zan Hodgeberg, ultimately. So my mother grew up in that family, part of the Rosenthal family. Her family was, as is a lot of the cases in this industry, was part of a scrap business family. And my great-great-grandfather, Ben Rosenthal, kind of started that, and it grew into a big business. So she grew up classical reform. That was the word that I was searching for. She was a little bitty lady, very smart, very artsy, very involved in the synagogue. When we got here, it mattered to her. She used to sing a lot of the Hebrew songs that I don't even remember anymore that we sang at camps, and I tried to sing to my kids as we grew up. And being Jewish was important to her and the family, and they all were active. She met my dad. Long story, probably don't have time for it, but her mom divorced my grandfather and then remarried a guy from Wyoming, and that's kind of was the connection. They ended up living in Dallas. My mother was a stay-at-home mom most of the time. She was an artist. She made pottery and made glass. We had a kiln in our house. Nobody has a kiln in their house. And she used to teach all the kids in the neighborhood how to make things. And it was really kind of fun. Our whole basement would be set up with tables, and all the kids in the neighborhood would come over. She was president of our sisterhood. She was president of the B'nai B'rith women at one point. She was a feisty little lady. And people that remember her will remember she was not forgettable. She died young. She was 56 when she passed. My dad was a sweet man. He was about 10 years older than Mom. Grew up in an Orthodox family in the only synagogue in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He lived, because of the way the family had gathered, his mother and her sister raised two families up the block from each other. So it was kind of a clan. It's the Pasternaks and the Levitts. And my cousins are now, from the Pasternak family, live in Des Moines, Iowa, and Phoenix, Arizona. And my dad had a sister, and she's deceased now, and they ended up in St. Pete, Florida. She married a guy from Greeley, Colorado, whose dad was a doctor up there. And I think my Aunt Arlene and my Uncle Lou, that's their names, they got as far away from Cheyenne as they could and moved to St. Pete. And so that's where my cousins grew up. So we were kind of spread out. So when my dad was Philip Levitt, yes, the name's my mother was Nina Levitt. Dad lived well into his 80s. After Mom passed, he remarried, and they lived here for a while. His second wife was named Roz, and then they moved to Miami, the land of the old Jew, and she had a place on Collins Avenue, and he lived the last 10 years of his life there. We were very close, and I miss him a lot.
Yeah.
One of the things that I will always remember is that every Friday night we would have Shabbat dinner. My mother would make, I called it orange chicken or roast beef, something like that. She always
Wait,
made
what is orange chicken? You have to tell us what that
It's
is.
chicken with paprika.
Okay.
It was orange. We called it orange chicken. Back in that day, people made Jell-O molds, and we always have Jell-O mold. We'd have salad, but back then you could only buy iceberg lettuce. It was just a different era. But every Friday night we all sat down together, and we'd have dinner. And then my dad and my brother and I, and sometimes my sister, would go to temple. We went every night. Rabbi Grafman was the rabbi at the time. I was one of Grafman's boys, and that was a big part of our life.
Yeah, so being Jewish was clearly important to them.
My dad was very involved in B'nai B'rith. He was president of B'nai B'rith here. Back then, B'nai B'rith was a much bigger organization. He was on the temple board. He was involved in a Jewish dental fraternity. I can't remember, Alpha Omega or something like that. My dad was a real personable guy. He was the kind of guy you go to temple and you were the last one to leave because he was going to talk to everybody. But he was a sweet man. He really was. And so my sister Gail, who now lives in Dallas, was very involved in her synagogue, worked for a JCC out in a couple of places out in California. And my brother, who lives in Columbia, Maryland, who is an officer and treasurer of his temple, a conservative temple, and actually works with the conservative movement from time to time as a consultant. So we all kind of learned the lesson, I guess, from our parents and from our grandparents, that being involved was really important.
Yeah, I can see where that definitely comes in your family. I'd love to hear a little bit more, just like broadly from you, about what it was like to grow up Jewish in Birmingham. You know, obviously this is a smaller Jewish population, but your family's very plugged into the Jewish community. What was sort of it like to be here and in this specific landscape?
It's interesting that we're probably one of the few families that weren't from here.
Yeah.
Especially when we first got here. And the size of the community hadn't changed a ton. But there weren't as many people moving to UAB at the time as there are now. Now it's a much more fluid community, people moving in and out. And so everybody here was related to somebody. We were related to nobody. What was kind of interesting, just because of the socialization that my parents had with different people, we ended up spending most of our holidays with families that went to Beth-El. And so we had a group of folks, the Packlers, the Kisbers, the Zarowskis, the Schiffmans, There were other folks that kind of floated in and out of the group, but we did all the holidays with them. And I called them aunt and uncle. That's just what you do here in the South. But they were like my family. And if something, there's a funny story that somehow I got scared one night. I don't remember the whole story. And I called my Aunt Barbara, so she came over and took care of me because we didn't have, my real aunt lived in Dallas, and she wasn't coming.
Yeah, you needed that adopted
Right.
family.
So we had that adopted family. My Rona Zarowski, her kids used to babysit me, and she was like a surrogate grandmother for me. So we had that kind of part of the Jewish community feeling connected in that way, but also felt part of the Temple family, and I felt just as equally comfortable at Temple Emmanuel or Temple Beth-El, and frankly at KI, although I didn't go there as much, but the people at all these places knew everybody. We all
Yeah.
knew each other. I know that being in Birmingham in the 60s and the 70s for Jewish people wasn't always great, but I don't remember much of that. I remember a little bit being called a dirty Jew at school. I went to Crestline, and there's always going to be some kids that heard something bad from their parents, but it wasn't overwhelming, and it never really stuck with me, although I remember it.
Yeah.
I do, funny story my mother would tell was after we had gotten here, and back then everybody didn't have a washer and a dryer, so you wash your clothes and you hang it out in the line out back. There was some Sunday morning she was out there hanging out sheets and whatever else she was going to hang out, and one of our nice neighbors came over and said, "Honey, we don't do this on Sunday."
Oh, interesting.
So I'm sure my mother, who was a bit of a fireball, she may not have reacted harshly to her because she was sweet in public. She was sweet all the time, but she had her moments. But that was a story that she used to tell. I think my mother couldn't wait to get out of here until she lived here for a while. And then you couldn't have blasted her out of here.
So maybe a little adjustment period.
Yeah, it was a very different culture. You think Rochester, New York to Birmingham, Alabama in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
different. Being here, and this affects me still today. I remember, because we were in Temple all the time. We all, just like at every synagogue, we sat at the same place. We sat right behind the Barish family. I used to see the same people all the time. But I remember being kind of enchanted by some of the people who were leaders in the community. And I remember thinking how important this must be to do these kind of things. I remember, Janet is back here. Not Janet, I'm sorry, Sally's here. Punch Aarons, David's, he was president of Temple Emmanuel. And I remember he just seemed so stately. And people respected him, and I knew what he did was important. I remember seeing Harold Apolinski walking around when he was a younger man, looking like a real aristocratic kind of guy. And you see Nina Cohen. She was a little bitty lady, and everybody, she was a fireball. And so men and women that took these leadership roles, and it made a difference. One story, I've not even told you this. When I was in Hebrew school at Temple Emmanuel, the funny part about that was we learned to read Hebrew from Cantor O's wife.
Okay.
Cantor at Beth-El taught us Hebrew. The wonderful irony of that. But on Sundays, we'd have some of the parents in the community, and I'll never forget that Mr. Barstein, Rodney and Mark's dad, would come down and teach us Hebrew. And he was the head of what in my mind was a big company. They started Bargaintown. And he was a leader in the community, and his family he was the dad of people I knew. That's all I knew. And what I gathered from that is how important it was for parents of my dad would do these things too, but parents took an interest in helping the other kids in the community. And that really, Mr. Barstein, I will never forget that. I always thought that was a really kind of cool thing to do.
Well, it's something that's actually, I think, kind of wonderful about the Birmingham Jewish community, and maybe this is true for a lot of small Jewish communities, but it is, in some way, synagogues and the Jewish community in general are sort of communal projects that kind of have to be. So that I feel like I understand some of what you're hitting on there.
And for me, and this rings true today for me, and I think it rings true for a lot of people in our community. We have two big synagogues, and KI was a smaller synagogue, but it was very active at a larger Orthodox community that has mostly become Chabad.
Yeah.
But all the places are warm and welcoming, and I really feel at home in any of them. I think that's still true, and I think it shows, at least in Birmingham, is that we think of ourselves as the Birmingham Jewish community, and that's why our federation acts the way it does, why our foundation acts the way it does. While I was president of Beth-El, I really spent real intentional time trying to work on the collaboration between organizations, and other people did too, but that was one of the things that I've been talking about.
Yeah.
You and I have been talking about, and been others, of how important that is, because we are a Jewish community. We're not just Reformed Jews or conservative Jews or Orthodox Jews. And so I think that's really important, and it allows ourselves to present ourselves to the community at large in a way that they can understand, because the differences, they're there, but they're not important from that point
Yeah.
of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that that's a big passion of yours and something we
Mm-hmm.
have worked on together. One thing I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask you, because we're talking about sort of pillars of the community too.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit about what it was like to, work with Rabbi Grafman?
Oh, sure. I love Rabbi Grafman. He I would say, my dad probably influenced me more than just about anybody, but everybody says that about their dad, or they want to. And my dad was a wonderful guy. Rabbi Grafman had a huge impact on me. If I wasn't at the JCC playing sports or doing youth group or things like that, I was at Temple Emmanuel. I was a tutor. I went through the bar mitzvah stuff, went to Sunday school. I actually liked Sunday school. I was one of those weird kids that actually liked it. We had some really intellectuals that taught Sunday school that most of the kids didn't like. I had Sheldon Schaefer and I have to think. Now I'm drawing a blank. But Bob Loeb, and so we had some really brilliant people that taught us, and it was a waste. It was too bad because most people didn't care for Sunday school. But I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of dealing with Rabbi Grafman, who really came across as kind of a hard guy to some people, but he was wonderful, and he taught me a lot about perseverance, taught me a lot about what it was to do the right thing. He was involved in organizing the clergy in our community across the denominations. Mm-hmm. He was one of the first classically reformed Zionists. Mm-hmm. He was a supporter of ZOA, and very different from what you would have expected from a rabbi from Louisville that came here, right after the war.
Yeah.
And he had to deal with the difficulties that Birmingham was going through, and I think he and some of the other people men that have really impacted my life, Abe Berkowitz, who I got to practice law with later, and Carl Friedman and Jimmy Permit and some of these others, General Friend. These are some people that they were great men, and they were great at a time when we needed it. Mm-hmm. Some people say, where are those guys now? And I kind of wonder. But going back to Rabbi Grafman, he worked tirelessly. He had a lovely wife that was very quiet and kind of in the background, but I'm sure she wasn't always at home. And he raised lovely kids. I still know Stephen, his son. But he was somebody that I could turn to if I wanted to for anything, and I really looked up to him for what he did in the community and what he stood for. And there were a lot of funny stories about him. He was a big football fan, and on Saturdays, the Saturday that Alabama used to play in Birmingham at Legion Field, those services miraculously ended early. And there was across the street, which now I can't remember what it's called now, but it's a retirement home now. But across the street from Emmanuel, there was a top of 21. It was a pretty fancy hotel, and there was a bus that would go from there to Legion Field, and they'd hold that bus for Rabbi Grafman. And
wow.
At the end of the service, his rabbinical robes would be flying off, and he'd be running across the street, and he'd go down to watch Alabama play football. I mean, he was in that way, he was a regular guy. Yeah. And he loved his boys, the Grafman boys. It annoyed my sister that she couldn't be bat mitzvahed, and it still annoys her. She still bitches a little bit about it, not really, but that was a different time, and that's one of the things that we have at Beth-El, that the tradition of Beth-El being an egalitarian place, and I know Emmanuel is as well. I'm glad we're past that, but.
Yeah, because at that time, though, it would not have been the norm.
It wasn't the norm.
Yeah.
And Birmingham wasn't exactly the cutting edge of progressivism.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of good things that I can say. It's a long conversation. I think Rabbi Grafman has got a lot of notoriety that he probably didn't like and didn't deserve. He made choices that people read into. I'm not going to fight about that, because people are entitled to their opinions about what kind of guy he was. But he was one of the ministers that Martin Luther King wrote his letter from the city jail about, and it's a very, very, as we know from working on the civil rights experience, it's a very important it was a very important time for Birmingham, and he just ended up being somewhat vilified in the eyes of some people. But I think if you look at the time, the Jewish community had a really interesting way to react to it. And he and the Kimberlings, Saul, and Carl and Abe Berkowitz and some of these other guys, who I just learned later because I was a kid.
Yeah.
So I didn't know.
You weren't probably very aware of what was going on in
No, not
Birmingham in
really.
the 60s.
There was something going on. I was aware of it. Birmingham was a different place. I remember coming over we lived in Crestline, and when we go every Friday night, we'd come over the mountain through Key Circle, and it was amazing. You go from over the mountain from English Village, and then you see this orange haze that kind of lived over Birmingham. And so you're coming into the day of the sun. You think, wow, that's pretty.
Yeah.
But it was. My parents said, oh, God, look at the pollution. But so during that time period, I kind of have a feel for that. I have a much better feel for the riots that happened in downtown when Martin Luther King was shot. I remember
interesting.
that.
What do you remember about that?
I just remember that there was rioting. I remember because we used to, the big difference between today and one of the big differences between today and then was we had 3 stations to watch, and so we all kind of had the same news feeds, just depending on whether you watched Huntley and Brinkley or Walter Cronkite or Howard K. Smith.
Yeah.
Whoever your dad watched or your mom watched on TV, that's what you watched. But they were talking about it. And so I was, at that time, I was 10, 11.
Yeah.
And so I was starting to be aware of what was going on. And I was bar mitzvahed in 1970. And, by then things in Birmingham were starting to change a little bit. And then later when I came back, I was fortunate enough to start practicing law with Abe Berkowitz at Berkowitz Lefkowitz. And they had a storied history of being involved in the behind-the-scenes stuff in the civil rights movement. And so through that, I really got a better feel for what the story was, but it wasn't my story, and it wasn't something that I personally felt. I think most kids at that age that grew up in the Jewish community were probably pretty well sheltered from it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that is what I've sort of heard across the board from people who would have been about your age during that time.
So where it really started to hit me in the face more was when I got fortunate enough to do Leadership Birmingham, and this was around the mid-90s when I did that. And what I learned through that process and got to know people through that process, including Odessa, who was a much younger woman at the time. She spoke.
That's Odessa Woolfolk, yeah.
And others who really helped teach us what happened and create relationships. One of the fun things, I don't think I told you this, I was on the board of directors of the H.E. Gaston Boys and Girls Club for several years.
Oh, neat! I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was the chair of one of the United Way VATs, the visiting allocation teams, and the agencies that I was responsible for were the JCC, which was funny, I've been president, the H.E. Gaston Boys and Girls Club, Salvation Army, and one other large organization. And I got to know Kirkwood Bolton, who had been A.G. Gaston's right-hand man for a long time.
Oh, interesting.
And they were run in a way that I thought I could really help these guys, and so I would sit down with them and say, okay, this is how we do it at the JCC, and this is how we do it. So after 2 meetings like that, they said, would you like to be on our board? And I had the lightest complexion on that board. It was filled with African-American educators primarily. And the meetings were fascinating. It was like a complete different culture than anything I had seen.
That's really cool.
And so that was really kind of an eye-opening experience for me. It was a wonderful experience that I stayed in contact with Kirkwood until he passed. And
wow.
I've not had much connection with him since in the last few years, but that was a really important player in the African American community for the kids on the west side that didn't have places to go.
Yeah.
It was kind of fun to be involved and interesting.
That is interesting, and I do want to ask you in a little bit more about sort of your passion around the civil rights experience. But I have 2 sort of law career related questions that I want to ask you as well. One is I'd love to just hear a little bit more about Abe Berkowitz and Carl Friedman and your relationship with them and anyone else in that sort of group. But then I'm also curious, and I don't think I actually asked you this when we were speaking previously. So you went to Tuscaloosa for law school. Were you always planning to stay in Birmingham? Did you know that you wanted to come back to Birmingham, or did you think you might go elsewhere?
I came very close to moving to Chicago.
Okay.
I went to Alabama. I loved it. I went to law school at Alabama. I just never really considered should I go somewhere else. I didn't apply anywhere else. I figured if I didn't get into Alabama, I didn't deserve to go to law school. I mean,
Okay.
I didn't take it as seriously as you would think I might have. But I figured at that point that I'd go to Alabama Law. But I had met a girl when I was in junior and senior, an undergraduate who was going to school at Tulane.
Okay.
And we fell in love, and we were going to get married. In fact, I spent my first summer after law school working for a law firm in Chicago.
Okay.
And I was gone. But the marriage didn't happen, and I came back to Birmingham. And, another traumatic story. But
We can save that.
yeah, that's for some other day. We need a lot more to drink for that. But I came back. But Birmingham was a great place. I knew everybody. It was home.
Yeah.
And so I finished out law school. While I was in law school, back then, so this was in the early 80s, and there weren't that many Jewish lawyers in the non-Jewish firms.
Yeah.
A couple, but not really that many. It still hadn't changed. And so the funny story is when I was interviewing for second-year clerkships, I got campus interviews with several of the law firms, and then the only ones I got invited back to were the Denneberg firm, the Berkowitz firm, and the Cerroti firm, which, okay, I understood that. But that was just, I dressed up nice. I wore three-piece suits and all that, and I had good grades. But that was just what Birmingham was at the time. It hadn't changed enough yet.
That's interesting, even in the 80s.
Yeah. But I don't hold it against anybody. That was just what it was.
Yeah.
But the funny part about it was when I wanted to do office visit. No, when I wanted to have the interviews on campus, the Berkowitz firm had signed up to interview on Rosh Hashanah, and the Cerroti firm had signed up to interview on Yom Kippur or something like that. They had young lawyers that weren't Jewish, and the irony of it was pretty funny. So I called Eddie Friend at Cerroti, and I called Harold Kushner at Berkowitz, and I called Rod Max at Denneberg. And of course, they all said, "Yeah, please come in and meet." And they got offers from all of them. It's just a funny story.
Yeah.
The irony of
That. There's some irony there.
So I went to work for Berkowitz Lefkowitz. It was a really hard decision, but I was going to go to tax school, and I'd worked for them after my second year and had a great experience. And they offered me a job, full-time job, after I got finished with tax school. And Cerroti had offered me a job to clerk for them after my third year of law school, before I went to tax school. And so, to me, do I take the full-time job with a place I know, or do I? But Cerroti I knew a ton of people there.
Yeah.
It was a hard decision, but I ended up going at Berkowitz, and I was there for 12 years. And because of that, I got to meet some really wonderful people, and people that I'm still friendly with and care dearly about. But to be able to see a Berkowitz on a pretty daily basis during the last years of his life was really, really rewarding for me. As the youngest lawyer there for a couple of years, I got to drive him, because he didn't drive. He was just,
Okay.
There's a lot of great Abe stories where he would just go out in front of his house and just stand there till somebody would pick him up. And
That's one way to
truly
do
happened.
that.
Yeah, it really did happen. But I used to go, his wife Estelle, I'd take him home. He had dialysis at the time. I'd take him to the hospital and sit with him. He'd go through, and then I'd take him home. And I got to know him and his wife pretty well. He was built just like me, a real Adonis, and short and stocky. And so I think he was just wonderful. And so I would hear his stories. And he had a million ties. He'd give me ties back when I wore ties. And so I got to know him, and I got to hear the stories, not from him. He would never say, "Yeah, I did this," or "I did that." But everybody else would tell the things that he did. And
Yeah.
he was literally world famous, truly one of the great people that lived. And he came from nothing out of Mississippi. Just had a great story of becoming a member of the bar as a very young person, and he had this booming voice. It was like the voice of God. And what mattered to him was that people be treated right. And so, from the stories that you've learned about him and the things that he did behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, the other thing that he did that I thought was pretty amazing is he was a member of what's called the Sonnabon Institute. If you go up into the JCC boardroom, you'll see there's a picture of the Sonnabon Institute that included Abe. These were gentlemen from around the country who raised money to buy arms for the precursor of the IDF, the Haganah.
Oh, interesting.
And they smuggled arms from Europe into Israel before 1948. And there was a great story that I don't remember all the details of Abe actually driving a truck with arms behind it, and he didn't drive. I can only imagine.
I was going to say, didn't you just say that he didn't drive?
So he was important for Israel. He was important for the Jewish community. He was a a well-respected member of the community, and a big civil rights advocate. And then, so later in my career, I left Berkowitz at one point to help start a tax practice at another firm, which had been a spinoff of the Cabanis Johnson firms called Walston Wells. And I felt that was pretty important because still at that time, this was the mid-90s, there still weren't that many Jewish lawyers outside of the Jewish firms.
Yeah.
And so I joined this group and worked with them for a while. Really enjoyed being there. It was a different culture. And then that it got to the end of that time period, some people left and went to other firms, and so I made a choice that I was going to go to another firm, and I interviewed with a whole bunch of different firms. Now, I'll step back. You asked about Carl.
Yeah.
I knew him as Uncle Bub because I grew up with his daughter Lolly,
Okay.
Lauren, who I still keep up with from time to time. You bet.
Yeah.
Her and her family. And so we would hang out at their house on the weekends. He was everybody's uncle.
Yeah.
So I knew him as that, but also knew him as a lawyer. And so, and as time went on, I got to be friendly with him and with Mason Davis, and I would see him here at the JCC. My lockers were my locker was near theirs. And I knew what a great guy he was, and everybody in the community knew. But he was a different kind of connection for me because it was more personal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so when I joined Cerroti, when I looked at different firms I joined Cerroti, I remember him calling me into the office and telling me how pleased he was. And I used to go visit with him. But he made everybody feel great. It wasn't unique to me, but everybody he talked to, when you talk to somebody like Carl, whoever he was talking to, it was the most important thing that he had going on right that minute. But he also was a leader in the community, not just in the Jewish community, but in the non-Jewish communities, social services. I believe he was the head of Goodwill at some point. There were several, I don't remember all the things that he did. He was a big leader in Temple Beth-El, which we've discovered a lot of the things that he did, again, a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. And so I feel very fortunate to have been able, and I'm not the only one, there's others in the community that had the ability to have those relationships, but I feel so, it's a word we used in Birmingham, I feel so blessed that I had those kind of opportunities, and that I got to know these men and women. There were women in the community that I knew. I mean, I think of Elaine Royal that you didn't have the pleasure of meeting, and connected to Mickey and to Carl, and like I said, Nina Cohen. There were all kind of people that were just really fabulous to get to know in the Jewish community. It made me feel a part of something that was important.
Yeah.
And that had, that's one of the things about never leaving Birmingham that is really kind of special, is that these memories are everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I could imagine that. And well, I guess this is kind of a good transition as well to talking a little bit more about your own leadership roles in the community, of which there are numerous. But I guess one thing I was sort of struck by, and it is all sort of coming together in this conversation, the influence of growing up here and all of these people and your family and the community. But I was struck by how young you were when you got involved in sort of communal leadership positions, particularly, knowing now that it's a little harder, I think, to recruit young people into some of those positions. So can you talk a little bit about different ways you've served in the community and also sort of getting started so young in those roles?
Sure. Well, I was always, my personality is to get involved. So whatever I got involved in, I ended up being in some kind of leadership role. It's what I do. I'm not a manager. I'm terrible at that. But I'm an agent of change. And so when I've gone in different organizations, that's where I've been the most effective. When I came back to Birmingham after going to tax school and started, my kids, when I came back, we had a 9-year-old, because Andrea, who I adopted when I married Paula, was little. She was a kid. We came back, didn't have any money. Had a bunch of student loans like everybody else back then.
That makes sense.
And so I felt like it was important. The first thing we did practically when we came back was we joined the synagogue, we joined the JCC, and we were going to get involved in the community. But what I didn't have the ability to do is really give money. And I knew that's money is mission. You've heard that.
Yeah.
But I didn't have it. And so there's a couple of reasons why I got involved early. One is I knew that I had a skill set that would be helpful. And I knew that their people were always looking for volunteers to help. Second, I wanted my kids to see me do it when they were little. You think about that.
Yeah.
Now that kept me away from home some nights when I was at meetings late. And so I think I got asked to be on the JCC board and the Temple board pretty quickly after we had been here for a short period of time. And then I ended up serving the remainder of somebody's term as treasurer at the JCC. And then it began like an 11-year run. So by the time I became president of the JCC, I think I was 38 or 39. So I must have been late 20s when I was the first as an officer. But I did all of those things. I think I served my first go-round for the Federation Board at that time period. But it was there was so much going on in the community. We were thinking about what's the JCC going to be like. We talked about moving it to Liberty Park. There was all these things that I was kind of taken aback. Not taken aback, it's not the right word. Amazed by how active and how important that was to the people that I would look up to. It's really kind of funny because I look at the guys that were in there at that time were in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and I thought these guys are giants, and I don't feel that way. I think when you get older, you just kind of don't realize how young people look at you when you're doing that.
Yeah, they might not have felt that way either necessarily.
Yeah. But I realized how important it was because of the way people acted and what they did, and so I enjoyed being involved. Got involved early. I ended up being an officer at Temple Emmanuel. I was chair of the building committee where we rebuilt this building in the 90s.
Oh wow!
Which was a real funny thing because I'm not a builder, not an engineer. But we had a great group of people. Abe Kaplan was involved. Jerry Held was involved. Eve Mazer was involved. Murray Fisher, Arlene's husband. We worked with the Evan Terry Associates architectural firms, and we were in charge of the JCC part of it. I also served on the Day Schools Building Committee that Steve Green and Alan Engel and others kind of ran, and it was a liaison between the two. And what was really cool is we had a campaign cabinet with the real giants of the community that were tasked with raising money both from the Jewish community and non-Jewish community, which is still something that goes on here at the JCC. And we made the decision we were going to stay here and then built the campus. And the Jewish population, penetration of our community into the Jewish population at that time was probably at an all-time high. We had huge membership. It was the shiny building on the hill.
Yeah.
The best fit in the center. I mean, it was really, we increased our membership. David Scher's brother Martin was president after me. Jerry Held was president. Jerry Held and Julian Brooke were before me. And it was just a really great time.
Sounds like an exciting time.
It was an
here.
exciting time.
Yeah.
And the community really had a crescendo of events, and everything was interesting. The focus of what the JCC was about was to bring Jewish people and make them feel part of the Jewish community. Because early on, when the JCCA movement started, and Birmingham's one of the original members of the JCCA, it's called YMHA back then, was to help Eastern European Jews become more American.
Yeah.
And by the time we were talking about rebuilding, and I was on the JCCA board, that's another thing I did, I was on the national board for a few years. The mission of the Jewish Community Center movement at that time was to make Jewish Americans more aware of their Jewishness and to
That's actually
create
really
more Jewish
interesting how
culture.
that flips. I never thought of that.
It's really kind of fascinating. And I think that's a really important function that now at the synagogues that we're really focusing on, because from the work we've been doing the last few years, we're working really hard to create programs and experiences that make people understand where their culture comes from and how we interact with the world in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, I don't remember as much of that from the temples when I was a kid, but we had staffs that were much smaller. Rabbi Grafman was everything. You had Rabbi Emmanuel, you had Rabbi Grafman as the rabbi, you had Miss Lasko who ran the Sunday school, you had Miss Broda who was the receptionist, and then a couple of people that helped kind of maintain the property. That was it. And then all the religious school stuff was mostly by volunteers. It just wasn't. You did religious services, and you'd have Purim carnivals, and you'd have things that were revolved around the Jewish calendar. But if you look at what we've been doing the last few years, one program after another, where we're trying to look at Jewish culture and how we want to create these meaningful Jewish experiences so that people feel proud about and enjoy coming to temple, because everybody can do whatever they want nowadays.
Yeah.
There's no limits on what you can do. So the focus of what I think that we talk about, that you and I and others at Beth-El, and I know they do at Emmanuel, I know they do at Chabad, is how do we make meaningful Jewish experiences that make our kids happy, make our kids want to be there, and make them feel loved and wanted in those places. And that's maybe we took that for granted back then, but now we have to compete.
Well, I think you're right. In a world where there are more options, more things competing for people's time and energy, it is a different function, and I think about providing different access routes and ways. So it's interesting to think about witnessing that transition. I'm wondering, on the sort of leadership note, if you'd be willing to share the story about Donald and what he said to you that really influenced you, because I just think that's such a lovely sentiment.
Yeah. Well, when I was a kid growing up, the day I turned 16, I started working at Parisians at Eastwood Mall, and which was a great place to work. A lot of us did. Eastwood Mall was kind of a hangout, and it was the coolest mall in town. Now it's Walmart, not quite the same. But I remember growing up in Emmanuel, seeing Emil Hess and Donald Hess, and Hal Abrams and other executives. These were like titans. These were these guys that they just seemed like they were just way up here, and I would see them walking around the stores when we'd be there, and they walk in there. You gotta pay attention, don't mess up. I didn't know who they were, and then as I got involved in the community, I got to know these people on a more personal level, and served in so many committees, with all of these folks. I think of all the committees I served with, Hal Abrams or Abe Kaplan, and I got involved and got to know Donald. Well, Donald is the leader of Parisians. As Emil got older, I would see him at the law firm. He would be down at the law firm I was working for from time to time. And so the story you're talking about was he was such an important person to me in terms of looking up to a leader that was a little bit older than me. He wasn't that much older than me, but he seemed older than me, and he certainly was an important member of the community. And so, but he was in our office a lot during this time period.
Yeah.
And I remember walking down the hall with him one day and had learned. I may get this a little bit wrong because it's been a long time, but Donald was involved in all kind of things in the business community, and all kind of things in the Jewish community in an extremely important level. I think he had organized his schedule so that he would take care of all his obligations for Jewish organizations on one day. And I think it was just the way he organized his life at the time.
Yeah,
I never asked him about it, but that's what I remember. And so he was in our office working on whatever we was working on at the time. And I remember walking down the hall, walking with him, and asking him about that. And I said, well, I guess you do that so that you can put all the Jewish aspects in your life in one pot so that you can focus on the important things that you do the rest of the week. And my memory of that moment was that he stopped and turned toward me. And I don't know if he remembers it, but I remember it. He turned toward me and he said, he looked at me in the eye. It was kind of a serious moment. It wasn't one of these jokey moments. Yeah. He said, the reason I do all those other things the other 4 days a week is so I can do the important things that I do in this one day.
Yeah, I think that's such a lovely sentiment.
It was, that had a huge impact on my understanding of what was important and what was not, because I was a lawyer, I was a tax lawyer, so I'm supposed to be worried about profits and losses and making money and all that kind of stuff. And it was a lesson from somebody who I respected, that what's really important. These are things I knew, but it was really touching to me. I still remember it, obviously. And so when we had our pre-conference, I know I mentioned this, and it really is one of the stories that I enjoy telling.
Yeah, well, it stuck with me too. Mm-hmm. So I think it's actually a really, a powerful sentiment, and I could see how that then would have influenced sort of your journey into leadership as well. And I guess one thing I'd love to ask you about, which you've also shown leadership on, and obviously is a project I'm excited about too, is when I started at Temple Beth-El, you were really one of the driving forces behind the project we're working on, the civil rights experience. Could you, and we've talked a little bit about that period and some of those people you got to know, but I'd love to hear from you, like why that was so important to you, and why you've sort of taken some leadership in that project.
Well, some of it goes back to college when I was first. I went to Mountain Brook, so it was pretty not very diverse kind of place to grow up. And I got to the University of Alabama, and all of a sudden I was thrown in a whole campus of all different kinds of people. And I got really involved in student government, and I got to be friends with a lot of different people from different communities. And I remembered how good that felt and how important that was. Worked on a couple of political campaigns after college for George McMillan, who was as progressive as a candidate could be at that time. And I remember back then, African Americans and Caucasian folks didn't date. It just wasn't what it was, and it bothered me. And I got to be friendly with some of the members of the black community in Tuscaloosa. But that was just kind of an introduction of a different culture that I was
different
in.
than where you
Then
were
I started
coming from.
working, and then I got fortunate was invited to participate in Leadership Birmingham, and I'd say that's where I really started to understand better what was going on because of the programs that you go through, and that's a whole different conversation. But one of the things they do that's just absolutely wonderful is in your first weekend of Leadership Birmingham, they always match you up with somebody who's not like you at all, and you become roommates. And they matched me up with a guy who was a minister named Paul Holman, who was the head of the Division of Youth Services, and he was the pastor at St. John's and another church. And we became fast friends. And by that kind of relationship and other relationships like I built, like I told you about with the A.G. Gaston Boys and Girls Club, through all those relationships in the NCCJ, which was at that time called the National Conference for Christians and Jews, I really just kind of fell in love with how important the relationships between the black community and the non-black communities were. I became good friends with the guy that was the head of the Islamic Society. And so it just became part of who I was to find that important. So when you fast forward back to right before you came, Rabbi Slater was involved. He came to Birmingham with a big idea of diving into the civil rights movement, which was a big thing that I've been talking about to a great degree already. And Bob Greenberg and him and me and others talked about, we really need to make sure, because we were talking about the Sticks of Dynamite story.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that people understood what that story was about.
That's the attempted bombing of Beth-El in
Right.
'58.
And so to fast forward to where you are, I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
So we planned that weekend event, and we brought Doug Jones and Bill Baxley in. That was actually pretty funny because Doug was running for Senate at the time, and I knew Doug socially and as a lawyer. And I remember we were trying to plan our event, and I said, I'll just call Doug and see if he'll come do this. And they said, you're out of your mind. He's not going to come do this right after the election. So I said, sure, we'll see. So I called him, and he answered the phone. And we talked for a while, and I told him what we were doing. He said, I think I can do that. I said, we have to keep in mind that if you win the election, this will be your first. It was really right after the election. It was the week of. I said, this will be your first public appearance after the election, or it'll be your first public appearance if you lose. So
It's a lot of pressure either way.
yeah. But they were terrific. And Rabbi Leff was the rabbi at the time. I guess it was before Slater. So Rabbi Leff was the rabbi. He was supportive of it, and we planned it. It was a great event, both at Emmanuel on Friday night and at Beth-El on Saturday night, full houses. And they were just really terrific programs. And what that did is it kindled a fire within a bunch of other people, including Barbara Bonfield and some of the others at Temple Beth-El, that we got to keep it going. We had connected with people in different churches and in the history departments at UAB. And so we started meeting, and then Rabbi Slater came along, and then we were trying to hire somebody. Actually, we were looking at hiring his wife, and you were interviewing for the same spot. And I
remember that.
Yeah, which was that would have been interesting to be in your spot at that at the time. But I remember going to Rabbi Slater after, and says, we got to find a way to hire them both because we need to do what we were already thinking. What are we going to do with the civil rights thing? And so that's how that got started. And you and I started talking about that immediately. I remember that, and that was kind of the genesis, to use a Jewish term, of the civil rights experience that you have built, and that we're trying to support and bring to a conclusion. It's really kind of morphed into much more than either of us kind of thought at the very beginning. But that was kind of, I don't know if that fully answers your question. But
No, it doesn't. Although, just to clarify, not that I have built, that a bunch of us at Beth-El have built together.
It's been the community. It's not just Beth-El. It's we've
really
led
the full Jewish
but
community.
It's a full Jewish community and the non-Jewish community to some degree.
Absolutely.
I think it's created bridges to different parts of the community that had gotten strained. And I think it's been a really positive experience. I'm so excited to see where it's going to go. And that, that was the thing that you and I got to through my law firm to create a sponsorship for our opening event to honor Carl was really kind of an eye-opening way that we feel like we can do that for others, because we have these giants from that time period that still have connections with families, and so this project has legs and it's going to be around for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because I know it has legs and it's going to grow and be an exciting thing for the whole community, I wanted to make sure we touched on
Sure.
it for the historical record.
Absolutely.
But I know we're reaching the end of our time, and I want to end on sort of an in-theme question, which is, you, even though your family's not from the South, which was something I didn't know before speaking to you previously, you've lived your whole life in the South. This is Southern Jewish Voices. I wonder if you could give some thoughts on what you think is sort of unique or particularly special about the Southern Jewish experience.
I will say, I don't know what it's like to live in a place like Atlanta.
Yeah,
And I would say that's a different experience today than it may have been 30 years ago.
definitely.
But to be from a small town that has a Jewish community that's still going to be around in 20 or 30 years, it's kind of a magical place to be. I mean, I'm blessed, and I like to use that word. I'm so thrilled and happy that we've got, between Glennis and I, we've got all of our kids are going to mostly be around here. I've got one kid that's going to be in California. Lauren's going to end up out there or
Yeah.
somewhere not in the South. But by and large, we're going to have all of our kids that are going to be in the South. Samantha, as has been mentioned before, she works here. And my grandson's been hired to work here. And it's so living in Birmingham in the Jewish community is like living in a city with all your cousins. It's close-knit. We know each other really well. Probably not as much as it may have been 20, 30 years ago, because we have more new people that have come in. But I think it's a place that I feel at home, and where to be Jewish you have to be intentional. And think about what that might mean.
Yeah.
I think, if you go to New York, it's probably not as important to be intentionally Jewish for the same reasons it is to be here. And so a lapel pin with an Israeli flag, people that meet me and they walk into my office, they know I'm Jewish based on what's on my wall. I remember hearing a rabbi come and speak at Temple Emanuel once and says, this is how you can tell what somebody's identity is if you walk into their home, how long will it be before you realize you're in a Jewish home? And so it's funny how you remember things like that. But I think Birmingham, because of the people, it's all about the people, and because of the families that are connected and interconnected, and because of how important it is for all of us to feel a part of a family, I think that's the Southern Jewish experience that we will remember. What we won't remember is communities like Tuscaloosa or Anniston. And I understand Anniston had their final service at Temple Beth-El down there recently. When I was at Emmanuel, one of the things we did is we merged in the Gadsden Synagogue and the Jasper Synagogue. I wrote an agreement for the Gadsden Synagogue coming part of Temple Emmanuel. I called it the Continuity of Life Agreement. And it was a way to bring in their history and their stories and their keepsakes. And I think there's probably a Gadsden room in Temple Emmanuel now that has all of that stuff.
There is. In fact, aren't there the windows, I think?
I think so.
Yeah.
It's been a while, so I don't remember. But that's the little sad part. So you've got all these small towns in Mississippi where a lot of the guys I went to college with grew up. Those communities are gone. And there's a book that came out several. It's Shalom Y'all, I guess, is it? That kind of chronicles a lot of that kind of stuff. So that's the past. The future is going to be, how do we maintain our Jewish culture in a positive way that speaks to our children so they want to be Jewish 30 years from now. And so that's what I hope we do.
Yeah. Well, we're trying to do at least.
Yeah, well, that's all we can do is try. But I think right now what we should be doing is focusing on how do we make being Jewish easier. I don't mean this the way it's going to sound, less expensive, but very inviting for our kids. I mean that's important to me because we've got all of our kids. There's young lawyers at my law firm that are doing that. We have some really great young people that are really passionate about wanting to be here. Because this is a fun place to live. Forgetting the Jewish part, it's a fun place to live.
Yeah, definitely.
But if we can make being Jewish easier for them and more accessible and more meaningful on their terms, not our terms, I'm gone. I'm 65, and I'm not really gone, but it doesn't matter what I think about that. It really matters what they find meaningful. And that's, you know, David Shear sitting out here, his brother used to give speeches about Mr. King Furniture, which is their old family store. And Martin got up at a Rotary meeting that I was at, and they asked him to talk about, what was your business model? And Martin's an old dear friend. Martin got up and says, we had a real simple, my dad had us, and his dad was real active here at the JCC. He said, we have one simple business principle. He said, find out what people want and give it to them. And that's what we need to do with our kids.
Yeah. Well, I know that we could sit here and talk about that very question for hours, but I'm going to let us end with that food for
Okay.
thought. And thank you so much, Ronald, for
My
being here
pleasure.
this evening and having this conversation with us.
Thanks,
So,
Margaret.
give a round of applause for Ronald.